Schneider Electric is proud to sponsor this podcast series. With a purpose to empower all to make the most of our energy and resources, our mission is to be your digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. At Schneider, we call this Life is On. Know more at se.com/au. My name is Jo Taranto and I'm joined today by Katrina Donaghy, the CEO and co-founder of Civic Ledger. And today we are talking about the world's first water market pilot on the blockchain. Katrina, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Katrina, you have worked in state and local governments and with Queensland urban water utilities. What drove you to start Civic Ledger? It was about 2016?
Yeah, so late 2016. So I spent many years, I did work in government. So originally I did humanities at Griffith University. So sociology was really at the heart of my thinking and my discipline. But I spent many years in state government and then moved into Brisbane City Council. And I was there working in the flood management team leading into the 2011 flood event. And I remember, you know, how I had an amazing boss named by Ken Morris, who's no longer with us, but he really taught me how to be an entrepreneur within Brisbane City Council, that we could solve problems with technology and we had to be really persistent because you're butting up against resistance. And then after the 2011 flood event, I followed Julie McClellan to the Queensland Urban Utilities in 2022 to work with her around strategy and growth, looking at water utilities of the future. And she really instilled in front of me about how important the customer was and looking at low-cost solutions to solve problems. She was one of the first ones bringing in resource recovery, decentralisation, nature-based solutions. So she really instilled a great discipline in me. And also we had an amazing guy in our team called Peter Hoppy, who was bringing in the Global Reporting Initiative, which was about ESG disclosure back in 2012. And now we're in 2022, and now it's a buzzword. When I finished at QU, I went over to a charity sector. And again, I guess what I was really interested in is how do donors get access to seeing where their money goes? And when you're working with Excel spreadsheets and proprietary databases and data servers in your organisation, it's very difficult to disclose or share that data, or it's trusted. And when I gave up my time in the paid world, I joined a startup. And we were looking at identity. And then Bitcoin started to come into my periphery. And I found a book in my children's library in 2016 about Bitcoin. And I read it. And that was the moment where everything changed. Because all of a sudden I could see a technology layer that could solve problems around data provenance, around removing intermediaries out of the transaction, and starting to talk about trust.
Wow, what a journey. And Civic Ledger's now been going for a few years. Tell us what you do.
Yeah, so I'm the CEO and I'm one of 4 co-founders. So Civic Ledger was created on the back of doing a pilot with the Queensland government. So before we founded the company, we looked at this technology from the lens of government-issued assets such as permits and licenses because they have intrinsic value in them. And we were able to work with the Queensland government way back in 2016 and explore the utility of this technology to solve some really interesting problems. And because we got market validation, first customer being government, it seemed right to form a company. And then we founded Civic Ledger in 2016. And at that time, the Australian government was doing the first ever business research and innovation initiative. And that's when they were putting problems into the market. And one of the problems was how to increase confidence within the Australian water markets. And we were 6 weeks old. We responded to that tender and they selected us to work with them for a 3-month period to look at a feasibility study on how could we bring confidence and transparency to the Australian water markets.
So what does Civic Ledger do that creates that confidence?
Look, I think one of the important things for your listeners is that technology is an enabler. You still got to know what is the problem that you need to be solving and then be technology agnostic and then choose your tools to better solve that problem. That's going to make it better than what things are today. So Civic Ledger, when we think about the name Civic Ledger, because that came from government, we looked at how do we improve the digital experience between citizens and government? Because I think we can all agree there's a low trust around how citizens engage with government. So we wanted to look at how this technology could streamline the engagement between these two parties and bring trust to the transaction. And blockchain is really good for that. And the reason why is it's what we call a distributed ledger. So when a transaction occurs between two parties may not be trusted between each other, we're able to assert those transactions into an independent system of record that is append only. So what it means is that you get the entire history of that transaction and it cannot be erased. And importantly, it's encrypted, so you have cryptography, but it's also what we call immutable. So once the transaction is agreed and put into the ledger, it can never be changed. And one of the most important things that we experience as citizens is that we actually defer the trust to government for them to hold the record of our data. We trust human entry of that data into proprietary databases, and government will work in silos. But we as citizens interoperate with so many levels of government through the life of our journey. And that's why Civic was something that we were very focused in, and how this technology could bring a digital transformation to government to improve the transactions between citizens and government to improve trust.
You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series, and I'm speaking with Katrina Donaghy of Civic Ledger. Katrina, for someone who hasn't interacted with blockchain before, what does it look like and how do you experience it?
Well, this is a very good question because it does always have a bit of a mystery about it. But what is important to understand is that the blockchain is the infrastructure layer that we build software on top of. So it is almost like you need to push the technology to the bottom of the layers and bring the user experience to the top. So it is like a SaaS platform. You log in, you have an account, you interact on it. But what is the difference is that you're able to see a link to the ledger ID. So as soon as the transaction is completed, you will get a ledger ID, which is hexagons and all that sort of stuff. You're able to click on that link and it will take you to what we call a block explorer. So for example, the Bitcoin has the Bitcoin block explorer. Ethereum has Etherscan. We're working with Hedera, which is another blockchain. The reason why we're using Hedera is because it doesn't have the same costs as Ethereum, and it's not a proof of work consensus. It's a distributed consensus mechanism, and plus their environmental credentials are a lot better. But once you click on that interaction with the Explorer, it will take you to the Explorer, and then you get a page which will show your transaction in the ledger. The challenge is that that's a horrible user experience. It is really important because it is this amazing page. You can go see the transaction and there's all these numbers and things like that. But we put a layer across that so you're able to see with confidence that your transaction is on that ledger so nobody can erase it. So basically, it's like using SaaS, but there's just an extra layer of infrastructure that we put into the technology. So we still work with databases. We work with JavaScript as a major language. We use graphical user interfaces, so we still need to use the same logon, two-factor authentication, all those sort of things. So it needs to experience like we always experience with technology. It's just that we have this verification process where you can click on it and verify that your transaction has been committed to the blockchain and nobody can take it away.
And you've had support from the CRC for developing Northern Australia.
One of the things that people don't really know in this country is that we have cooperative research centres, and it's something that I find fabulous to work with because they're very research focused, very innovation focused, and they're really focused on local problems. So we were very fortunate to be introduced to the CRC way back in early 2019, and they do EOI processes, expressions of interest, and they are the custodians of delivering the white paper for developing Northern Australia. And they're very focused on how do we improve regulation and governance to allow a new economy to emerge. But they see that there are key barriers to unlock that investment, and they can see that water is one of those barriers. If we don't have access to water and water markets, then investors don't have confidence to bring their businesses to Northern Australia. So they liked what we were doing, And we did an EOI, and in January 2020, we started off doing the pilot in the Atherton Tablelands. And it was because we have strong leaders like irrigators who are very digitally savvy, want to see things different. They want to see their problems solved.
Is that why you advocate that there's a need to rethink the way that water markets in particular are designed and governed?
Yeah, so what we see is we are really good as a country on bringing water markets to understand how we can allocate this very precious resource to its highest values use. And we're known around the world for that leadership. But over the last 25 years, water markets have become extremely complicated. And as a result, we're not getting the liquidity, and irrigators are not necessarily having confidence with the way the water markets operate because of the proprietary marketplaces, but also interoperability with the state registries. So rethinking how water markets are to be designed, instead of looking from a top-down perspective and looking from a regulation lens and imposing compliance, we actually turn it on its head and we actually say, how do we design internal governance where we design the water markets that are compliant by design? That means that we bring in the rules, we automate the rules. So the level of compliance is removed out of the market so the irrigators trust the market. They know that when they're in the market, their trades are legal, they're compliant, but they're also getting access to all the right information at the right time.
You've touched on it there in terms of trust and transparency, but why is it so critically important to have, accountability and trust and transparency and also independence from vested interests in something like the water industry?
Well, I think when we think about the economics of what water does for us as a world, we all know that water is now very scarce. So we need to ensure we're able to account for every drop of water. So how much water do we have? How much water we're using? How much water we're sharing? But all of those accounts sit in different databases. So we take the lens of understanding how to digitize water. How do we actually bring the characteristics of water? Because water is not homogeneous, it's very heterogeneous. So how do we account for water through the lens of digital? So we want to know, how do we redesign water accounting systems and water trading platforms that interoperate, and all the data that is associated with that water accounting we can all agree on?
And how does blockchain technology enable this to happen?
There's some characteristics of blockchain technology that become very useful or good utility when it comes to marketplaces. As I mentioned, it is a shared infrastructure layer. It's what we call an independent system of record. We're able to use such as automatic logic, where we take rules and we automate that through code. So when those rules are agreed to and they hit the right levels of execution, those rules can be executed in real time, and you don't need administrations in the middle to check, is there enough data, is there enough water in that account, do they have the right to trade, So blockchain technology becomes very effective because it enables us to do a digital twin of a marketplace, and it provides us 4 windows into that marketplace. A window for the regulator, a window for the irrigator, a window into the market, but most importantly, a window for the public to see. So blockchain technology is great because it's independent, it's shared infrastructure, it's distributed, and when you apply a contract such as a smart contract for the rules, you're able to verify that something happened at a certain time. It has a timestamp and a date stamp, but it also is append only. That means that the history can never be erased. And that's important when you need to have trust and confidence in a water market, that you're able to see its history. Because if you can understand the history, it will give you an understanding of the future.
You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series, and I'm speaking with Katrina Donaghy of Civic Ledger. It sounds like it's quite the learning curve for a lot of people. Are you seeing resistance, or are you seeing a real uptake in interest now?
I think, when we first started all of this many years ago, there was an enormous amount of resistance, largely because of unfamiliarity. As with any emerging technology, it is, regardless of it being blockchain, AI, machine learning, there will always be a resistance because people don't like change. And it's not a technology problem, it's a human problem. We don't want to change, we don't want to do things differently. So you have to do an enormous amount of education and you need to take people on the journey. But again, it's about having the narrative around the problem and what are the pain points and how this technology can start to alleviate those pain points and make things better. So we've always found that the person who has the problem is much more incentivized to look for ways to solve it. And they may come out of their comfort zone, but as long as you're engaging with them and taking them on the journey.
Katrina, if you're listening and you're from an organisation, you want to get started with blockchain, what do you do first?
Well, the first thing is don't talk to your IT division. That's a big no-no. The reason why is that they're all interested in implementing a solution rather than actually thinking about how to design the solution. So it's important that leadership is there, that there is a leadership that will take ownership on data and governance and redesigning business models, because when we talk about blockchain technology, it's actually a governance technology. It's about institutional governance and reorganizing that governance and how data becomes critical to those business models. So you need to be able to be thinking about your customer. So normally the people in the room that need to have the conversation first is the person who's responsible for customer engagement, because you're solving the problem for them, not for you. Because customers want to have a better interaction with you, and ultimately you want to have a trusted relationship with your customers. So your customer person, the most important person, strategy, finance, and then legals. But you also need to have an understanding of where do we want our future to be and how is data at the center of that, and how do we bring trust and transparency, because you need to break down the silos internally. And so often it's you that's the problem, not the externality of your, but it's really about having a conversation, talking about the problem, and then talking to people like us, talking to the industry and saying, well, what's your experience? Because it's not about putting a blockchain on it. That's the last thing you do. You hear in the old days, like, oh, just put a blockchain on it. Don't do that. You really need to understand what is the problem we need to solve and what are the pain points and where this technology has those advantages, because then you need to start thinking about privacy, security, consent, consensus, those sort of questions. And it becomes a philosophical conversation and very much driven by ethics.
So you've had quite the journey. What's next for Water Ledger, Katrina?
Yeah, so it's great now because in 2022, the world is a lot different. I think as people from around the world are starting to see that governments are looking at central bank digital currencies. We're starting to see digital assets. We're understanding, I'm sure your listeners are starting to see the word non-fungible token or NFTs, and they start to bristle and go, I don't want to talk about NFTs. But these technologies are really important because, yes, there will be a bubble around the NFTs, but they play a very important role around our ability to digitize them and assert ownership and authority across them. So building on the work we did in 2020, where we looked at the pilot of, is blockchain technology the right technology to build new markets of the future? We're now back at the table with the CRC for Developing Northern Australia and bringing Water Ledger into Atherton, onboarding those 1,000+ irrigators onto the platform. And we're using that as a test bed to understand what is the digital infrastructure layer and the governance we need to roll out water markets across Northern Australia. And we're just about to start working with South East Queensland Water to transfer their water markets across into Water Ledger. And we're looking at opportunities across the world. But I think now we're having a mainstream moment. I think people are less worried about the tech and more about how do we solve the problem.
I've been speaking with Katrina Donaghy, the CEO and co-founder of Civic Ledger. Thanks, Katrina, for your time.
Thank you so much.